The third hour of the harvest reception at Sandsmere House, and Winifred Carroway had been on her feet since dawn, which was perhaps why she did not see the king. She had crossed the long gallery with a folio of music pressed to her chest, her plain gray gown brushing the polished oak, intent only on reaching the instrument before the dancing began. A gentleman stood near the cold north window in a coat of undyed wool, his boots dull with road dust, his face turned toward the rain. She took him for a steward, sent up from the stables, some weary man of business, waiting to be told where to stand. She inclined her head to him, a small courtesy between two people who served, and because he looked tired, and because she was tired, she spoke the truth that had been sitting behind her teeth all that long week. "The Almshouse Fund is a fraud," she said quietly. "They will toast its founder tonight in 3 kinds of wine, and not 1 shilling of it ever reached a single musician. You would do better to warm yourself by an honest fire than wait on these people." Then she curtsied to the man she believed to be the steward's master, a tall figure in scarlet and gold who had just entered behind her, and she went on her way before either man could answer. She did not yet know that she had it precisely backward. She would not learn it for another quarter of an hour when the whole gallery turned to bow toward the tired man at the window, and a name passed down the room like a draft under a door. She did not see it yet. You may already. To understand how a copyist of music came to insult a king without raising her voice, you must go back 6 years. To the winter, the Carroway name was broken in a single afternoon. Winifred's father had been an organ builder, the finest in the county of Loamshire, a maker of instruments whose voices outlasted the men who commissioned them. He had built the organ in the parish church and the chamber organ at the bishop's palace, and at last a great instrument for the late Earl of Sandsmere who had wished his chapel to sing. He had worked 2 years on it. He had used his own savings to buy the rare metal for the pipes when the Earl's first payment came late, trusting the word of a peer as he would have trusted Scripture. The Earl died with the work nearly done, and the Dowager Countess, who did not love music, and loved expense even less, looked at the unpaid account her husband had signed, and found it inconvenient. She did not refuse it openly. She did something quieter and more lasting. A quantity of silver plate went missing from the chapel that same month, and the steward was instructed to remember that the organ builder had been given keys, and a magistrate who dined often at Sandsmere was given to understand which conclusion would least trouble the great house. There was no trial. There did not need to be one. A word in the right rooms is heavier than a verdict, and the word that went out was that old Carroway was not to be trusted near other men's silver. The commission was withdrawn. The half-built organ was carted away and never finished. Her father's other patrons grew suddenly forgetful of him. Within the year his health failed, and within 2, he was dead, and Winifred buried him with the last of what they had, and walked out of her girlhood owing a debt of nearly £400 to the tradesman who had supplied the metal he never lived to install. She did not weep at the graveside. She had done her weeping in the long nights of his illness, when he had held her hand in his ruined fingers and told her again and again that he had taken nothing, that a man's name was the one possession no creditor could seize and no countess could buy. She had believed him then. She believed him still. It was the single fixed point by which she steered, so she had made herself useful. She could read music as easily as speech, and write a fair hand, and tune a pianoforte better than most who called themselves masters of it. She took work where a gentlewoman might take it without disgrace, copying scores for the music sellers, tuning instruments in houses that did not ask her name twice, teaching the daughters of merchants their scales. It was honest. It was poorly paid, and by a turn of fortune so bitter she could taste it. The steadiest of that work had come this past half-year from Sandsmere House itself, for the Dowager Countess had discovered late in life the uses of charity, not the giving of it, the being seen to give it. She had founded the Ragby Almshouse for indigent musicians, a benevolence for old players fallen on hard times, and she had let it be known across 3 counties that her late husband's love of music lived on in his widow's generosity. There were dinners for it. There were subscriptions to it. There was twice a year a grand reception at Sandsmere, where the county gentry came to be charitable in their best clothes, and the dowager sat beneath her husband's portrait and accepted their admiration as a queen accepts tribute. 1. And Winifred, who needed the work and could not afford pride, had been engaged to copy the fund's accounts into a fair ledger for the benefit of its subscribers. That was how she knew. She had copied those figures for 6 months in a cold upper room, and a copyist who can read music can read a column of pounds and shillings, and the columns did not balance the way a charity's columns should. Money came in by the subscription. Money went out by the door of the great house. Almost nothing went out to any musician. The names of the supposed beneficiaries were there, written in the steward's hand, 12 old men with 12 old trades, and against each name a sum dispersed, and Winifred had set herself, quietly, over those 6 months, to find even one of them. She had found one, a blind violinist named Galloway, lodged in a damp room above a chandler's shop in the market town, who had played in the late Earl's own household 40 years before. The ledger said he had received £8 at Lady Day. Winifred had climbed his stair with a copied page in her hand, and he had laughed at her, not unkindly, and held up his hands which shook with the palsy, and told her he had not had 8 pence from Sandsmere in his life, and that if she had come to mock an old man, she might save her breath, for better than she had done it before her. She had given him 2 shillings of her own, gone down the stair with a coldness in her chest that was not the weather. She had said nothing. What was there to say? And to whom? She was a copyist, with a ruined father's name. The Dowager Countess of Sandsmere was a pillar of the county. A word in the right rooms is heavier than a verdict. She knew that better than anyone alive. So she had carried it, the knowledge of the fraud, through the autumn, copying the false figures into her fair, clean hand, and despising herself a little for it, telling herself she would speak when she had proof that could not be waved away, telling herself she was saving for the debt, telling herself a great many things that a frightened person tells herself at 2 in the morning. And then the harvest reception had come, and she had been kept on her feet since dawn arranging the music and tuning the instrument, and an exhausted man in a plain coat had stood at the window, looking as cheated by the world as she felt, and the truth had simply walked out of her mouth before her fear could stop it. The tall figure in scarlet, to whom she had actually made her curtsy, was Sir Septimus Beddoe, the Lord Lieutenant of the county, a vain and harmless man who collected such honors the way other men collected snuff-boxes. He had taken her courtesy as his due and forgotten her before she reached the door. He was not the king. He had merely the height for it and the color. The tired man at the cold window was the king. He had come to Loamshire without ceremony, as he sometimes did, to see a county as it truly was rather than as it arranged itself to be seen, and he had ridden the last stage in the rain and slipped in by a side door, while the great folk were still bowing at the front. And he had wanted nothing in that moment but to be left alone by his window until the warmth came back into his hands. He was not a young man. He had a plain, heavy, watchful face, and the manners of a country squire, and a way of going very still when something interested him. Something had interested him. Winifred learned all of this. As the gallery turned and bowed and the name went down the room, in the space of a single breath that would not come. She stood by the pianoforte with her folio still clutched to her chest and understood, all at once and far too late, that she had told the King of England that his hostess was a thief, and had then turned her back on him to curtsy to a man who collected ribbons. The Dowager Countess understood it in the same instant. The Dowager Countess understood a great many things very quickly when they touched her standing. Let me tell you what a clever woman does. With a catastrophe, she does not deny it. She uses it. By the time the king had been bowed to a chair and given the warm wine he had not asked for, the story had already changed shape in the dowager's hands. The wretched copyist, she murmured to the Lord Lieutenant, behind a fan and a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as she wished and no farther, had insulted His Majesty to his face, had stood in the gallery of Sandsmere and spat slander at the crown. The girl was unbalanced, of course a tradesman's orphan with a grievance, the daughter of a thief who had robbed the late Earl's own chapel. Did the Lord Lieutenant not recall the silver, The whole sad business, the bad blood ran in the family. One could only pity her and put her out before she disgraced the house further. She is a viper. The county took in out of pity, the dowager said, and we are repaid as charity is always repaid. The Lord Lieutenant, who had been curtsied to, and was therefore disposed to think well of himself, and ill of anyone who troubled the afternoon, nodded gravely and agreed that the girl must be removed. And there, by the cold window, the master of the king's private music heard every word. His name was Florian, Marquess of Hartsbourne, and he had come north in the king's small party because he went very nearly everywhere the king went, and because the king trusted his ear and his judgment above any man's at court. He was 33, tall and spare, with the still face of a man who has trained himself out of showing what he feels, and he had been standing in the shadow of a pillar when the gray-gowned copyist crossed the gallery and told a tired stranger that the almshouse fund was a fraud. He had felt something move in him at her words that he did not, at first, examine. He examined it now, listening to the dowager rearrange a frightened girl into a villain, and what he felt was not pity. It was recognition. He knew exactly how the machinery worked that the dowager was setting in motion, because he had watched it work once before, on someone he had loved and had been too young and too far away to stop it. He said nothing. He had learned long ago the uselessness of saying things into the wrong room. He watched the copyist instead across the length of the gallery, and he marked the door. She was taken out through, and he marked the steward who took her, and he began, behind his still gray eyes, to count. They put Winifred out before the dancing. Mrs. Tregown, the housekeeper, did it kindly, which somehow made it worse. She was not a cruel woman, only a frightened one, with a place to keep and a daughter to dower, and she folded Winifred's gray shawl into her hands at the foot of the servants' stair, and told her she had best be gone before the lamps were lit, and that there would be no character given, and that she was sorry. Truly, she was. But the girl ought to have kept her head down. A body in service learns to keep her head down, or she does not eat. Your father had the same trouble, Mrs. Tregown said, not unkindly, looking at the floor. He could not let a wrong sit quiet. It is no way to live, Miss Carroway. It is no way to live. That was the second time the dismissal of her was spoken aloud, the first having been the dowager's viper behind the fan, and it landed differently in the dim stairwell than it had in the bright gallery, landed as a kind of tired wisdom from a woman who had survived by the very keeping quiet that had killed Winifred's father. She took her shawl. She did not argue. There was no one in the house who would have heard her if she had. She walked the 4 miles back to her lodging in the rain that had soaked the king, and she did not weep on the road, because she had taught herself a long time ago not to weep where the world could see, and because the thing in her chest had gone past, weeping into something colder and clearer. She had told the truth. She had told it to the worst possible man in the worst possible way, and it would cost her everything, the work, and the small wages, and the slow saving against the debt, and very likely her liberty. For slander against the crown was not a small thing, and the dowager would not let a weapon like that lie unused. And the truth remained true. The fund was a fraud. Galloway had not had 8 pence. 12 old men had been written into a ledger to gild a cruel woman's name, and the only person in 3 counties who knew it was walking home in the dark, with no character, and no protector, and a dead father's name to keep. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that she was not the only one who knew, and the other who knew had spent his whole adult life learning patience. The Marquess of Hartsbourne did not sleep that night at Sandsmere. He sat up in the cold guest chamber they had given him, and he thought about his sister. Her name had been Curtsied, and she had been the better musician of the 2 of them, a girl who could make a borrowed harpsichord weep, and she had been taken up at 17 by a great patroness much like the Dowager of Sandsmere, a woman who collected gifted young people the way some collect porcelain, to be displayed and then, when the novelty cooled, to be put away. Curtsied had given that house 3 years of her playing for the promise of a settlement that was always coming. The settlement never came. When she fell ill, the patroness found her tiresome, and when she grew too ill to play, the patroness found her absent, and Florian, away at his schooling and trusting that great people kept their word, had come home too late to do anything but sit by the bed. She had died at 21, owed everything and given nothing, and the patroness had worn black to the funeral and called it a sad loss to music, and no one had said the word that was true, which was that she had been used up and thrown away by a woman whose categories could not measure what she had been. Florian had been 19. He had learned in the years after 2 things and held to them. The first was that the machinery which destroyed his sister was real, was everywhere, ran on the silence of frightened, decent people, and would never be stopped by grief or by a young man's rage. The second was that it could only be stopped by patience and proof, gathered quietly, brought into a room from which it could not be dismissed, in front of the one authority the machinery could not buy. He had spent 14 years becoming the kind of man who could stand in that room. And tonight, by a cold window, a gray-gowned girl with a folio of music had walked up to that one authority and, mistaking him for a steward, told him the truth that everyone else in the house had agreed not to know. He found Mrs. Nastra, Trégown at first light, in the still room, before the house had woken. He did not threaten her. He had learned that frightened people cannot be threatened into honesty, only into deeper silence. He sat on the edge of the still-room table in his plain traveling coat, and asked her gently who kept the accounts of the almshouse fund, and where the ledgers were lodged, and whether the housekeeper of so well-run a house had ever, in her long service, seen so much as a single old musician come to the door of Sandsmere to be relieved. Mrs. Trégown looked at her hands. She thought of her daughter's dower. She thought, too, of a gray-gowned girl walking off into the rain with no character, and of an organ-builder dead. These 4 years of her wrong he could not let sit quiet, and of all the things she had kept her head down to avoid seeing. There was a copyist, she said at last, very low. Miss Carroway. She kept the fair ledger this half-year in the north upper room. Her own working papers may be there yet. Nobody thought to clear them, she being put out so sudden. She is a viper the family took in out of pity, the Marquess said in the dowager's own cadence, gently watching the housekeeper's face. Is that the truth of her, Mrs. Trégown? The housekeeper was quiet a long moment. No, my lord, she said. It is not. It was the 3rd time the label was spoken in that house, and the only time it was spoken in order to be denied. And the woman who denied it had a daughter to dower and a place to lose, and denied it anyway, in a cold still room, at first light, to a man she did not yet know was the king's own confidant. The Marquis thanked her and went to the north upper room and found in a drawer that no one had thought to clear the working papers of the dismissed copyist, not the fair clean ledger that hung downstairs for the subscribers to admire. The rough copy beneath it, the crossings out, the marginal sums in a small, precise hand where a careful mind had set the money that came in against the money that went out and found the difference, and folded among them a single page in another hand entirely large and tremulous and palsied. A few lines dictated to a copyist and signed with a cross, swearing that Galloway the violinist had received nothing from Sandsmere in his life, and that the lady might do with the truth as she pleased, for an old man past mending had nothing left to fear. The girl had been gathering proof, quietly, for months, trusting no one, waiting until it could not be waved away, exactly as he had taught himself to do. And she had done it alone, with no court behind her, and no king's ear to whisper into, only her own stubborn refusal to copy a lie into a clean hand and call it finished. The Marquess of Hartsbourne stood in the cold upper room with her papers in his hand, and for the first time in 14 years something in his still face moved that was not grief. He found her 3 days later in the market town, in the damp room above the chandler's shop where the blind violinist lodged. She had gone back to Galloway because he was the only person left who knew what she knew and would not call her mad for it, and because she had nothing else to do with the wreck of her week, and she was sitting on the old man's single chair tuning his cracked violin so that he might at least have music, when a tall man in a plain coat filled the low doorway and took his hat off to her as though she were a duchess. "Miss Carroway," he said. His voice was low and level, the voice of a man who never needed to raise it. "I have read your figures." She stood so quickly the chair scraped. She did not know him. She knew only that a gentleman had climbed a poor man's stair to find her, 3 days after she had been turned out for slandering the crown, and that gentleman who came looking for her now came to do her harm. She put the violin down with great care, because it was Galloway's and not hers to break. And she faced the stranger with her chin up and her hands cold. "If you have come from Sandsmere," she said, "you may tell the Countess that I have said all I mean to say, and will say it again to any magistrate she likes. My father did not steal her silver. The fund is a fraud. I copied it with my own hand. I am done being afraid of that house." The man in the doorway did not move. Something passed over his still face, very brief, gone before she could name it. "I have not come from Sandsmere," he said. "I have come from the man at the window." It took her a moment. When it came, the blood left her face. She put her hand to the back of the chair. "He is not angry with you," the Marquess said. "That is the first thing you must understand, because everything else follows from it, and you have had 3 days to imagine the worst, and the worst is not what happened. He is not angry." A frightened girl told the tired stranger the truth, and turned away before he could thank her, and he has thought of little else since. The anger in that house is the Countess's, and she has dressed it in the king's colors to frighten you, and it has frightened you. And that was its purpose. It is hers, not his. Winifred sat down slowly on the old man's chair. Galloway in the corner had gone very still, his blind face turned toward the stranger's voice. "Who are you?" she said. "I am the man who should have been standing where Sir Septimus Beddoe was standing," the Marquis said, with the ghost of something that was almost dryness. "You made your curtsy to the wrong man, Miss Carroway. You have a gift for it. I am Hartsborn. I keep the king's music. And once, a long time ago, I had a sister whose name a woman very like the Countess of Sandsmere wrote into a ledger and then wrote out of the world. So you will forgive me if I take an interest in your figures." She looked at him for a long moment. This tall, still man who had said the word sister with a care that told her more than the word itself, and something in her that had been braced for a blow for 3 days, did not quite know what to do with the absence of one. "What do you want of me?" she said. "The truth in a room where no great person can wave it aside," the Marquess said. "You have been gathering it the right way, and the lonely way. You need not gather it alone any longer." Over the next fortnight, while the Dowager Countess of Sandsmere wrote letters to magistrates about a deranged copyist who had slandered the king and ought to be bound over for the assizes, the Marquess of Hartsborn did a quieter thing. He did not contradict her letters. He let them go out. He had learned that an antagonist, sure of her ground, does not guard it. He gathered, instead. He went himself to the chandler's shop and took down Galloway's account in the old man's own halting words, witnessed by the chandler and his wife, the £8 the ledger swore had been paid, and the 8 pence that had never come. He found, by patient asking in poor streets, 4 of the other 11 names from the fund's roll, 3 of them living, and 1 lately buried by the parish, and not one of them had ever had a farthing from Sandsmere, and 2 had never heard of the almshouse that claimed to relieve them. He had a clerk make fair copies of Winifred's working papers, the rough sums beneath the clean lie, and he kept the originals himself, sealed, because he knew what such a woman would do to paper if she could reach it. And reach for it? She did. Watered came back to him through the steward who had begun to fear which way the wind was setting, that the Dowager had ordered the fund's true accounts brought up from the estate office and burned, every subscription book and every disbursement sheet, so that nothing should remain but the fair, clean ledger that hung for the subscribers to admire. The one Winifred had copied, the one that told the gilded lie, she had burned her own books to be safe. She did not know that the copyist she had turned out had kept the rough workings the clean ledger was made from, nor that those workings were now sealed under the Marquis's own hand, nor that an old blind violinist had set his cross to the truth on a folded page. She had guarded what she thought was the only door. She did not know there was another. He met Winifred a dozen times across that fortnight, always with Galloway in the room or the chandler's wife at the foot of the stair, because he would not have her name touched, and he watched her work, and she watched him, and neither of them said anything that proper persons might not say, and the room grew warmer than the fire in it could account for. He brought her, once, a folio of his sister's old music, copied in a girl's hand 20 years dead, and asked her, without quite asking it, whether she would set it in fair order for him, and she understood that he was not commissioning a copyist. He was giving her the only thing he had of the person he had lost and trusting her with it. And she did not make light of the trust. "Sit down," he said to her once when she had stood too long over the papers and gone white. "Eat something. You cannot mend the world on an empty stomach, and the world will keep until you have." She read it as coldness, the bluntness of his commands, the way he never softened them. The old blind man in the corner, who could not see the Marquis's face but had spent 40 years hearing what voices did not say, read it otherwise, and smiled to himself, and said nothing. The reckoning came at the Michaelmas assembly. The Dowager Countess had planned it as her triumph. The king's small party was still in the county, lingering longer than anyone had expected, and she had secured through the Lord Lieutenant the promise of His Majesty's presence at the great Michaelmas assembly in the county rooms, where all of Loamshire would see the king honor the founder of the Ragby almshouse beneath the chandeliers. She had ordered the deranged copyist bound over to appear, meaning to have the girl produced and denounced in the same bright room, the slander against the crown answered before the whole county, the Carroway name finished for a second generation in a single afternoon. A word in the right rooms. She had built her whole life on the principle, and it had never once failed her. Winifred came to the county rooms in her plain gray gown, the only good one she had because she had been bound over and had no choice, and because the Marquis had sent her a single line in his level hand, telling her only to come to stand where she was put, and to say nothing until she was asked, and to trust that the truth she had gathered the lonely way would not be carried alone into that room. She stood at the side of the great chamber among the lesser people, the tradesmen and the clerks, and watched the county fill it with silk and candlelight, and watched the Dowager Countess of Sandsmere take her place beneath a banner worked with her dead husband's arms, magnificent in grey and diamond, certain as a tide. The rival Miss Agnes Penrose, a polished heiress the Dowager had been grooming this 12-month to marry well and reflect well, stood at the great lady's elbow in blush silk, and looked at the grey-gowned copyist across the room the way one looks at a stain on a floor that will shortly be scrubbed away. Then the king came in, and the room went down like wheat before wind. He was not in scarlet now. He was in a plain dark coat, much as he had worn in the gallery, and he had the same heavy, watchful face, and he let the bowing go on for exactly as long as it needed to, and not a moment more. And then he took the chair that had been set for him and looked around the bright room with the unhurried attention of a man at a horse fair. Beside him, a half-step back, in a coat of dark blue with a white cravat and no ornament at all, stood the Marquis of Hartsbourne, still as a carved figure, his eyes moving once across the room and resting, for the length of a breath, on a grey gown by the wall. The Dowager Countess rose to make her address. She thanked His Majesty for the honor he did her late husband's memory. She spoke of music, of charity, of the duty the fortunate owed the fallen, of the 12 old players her benevolence had lifted from want. She was magnificent. She was practiced. And then, because she could not resist setting her triumph in the brightest possible frame, she turned the matter to the unhappy duty that also fell to her that day, the painful necessity of answering a slander spoken in her own house by an unbalanced young woman of bad family, against the sacred person of the crown itself. "Let her be brought forward," the Dowager said, "that His Majesty may see what manner of creature repays charity with venom." This was the third voicing of the slander against Winifred, spoken now in the most public arena of all, before the king and the county and the chandeliers, and it was meant to be the last word ever needed about her. The steward brought Winifred forward into the cleared space before the king's chair. She came with her chin up, and her hands cold, and her father's name held like a coal she would not drop. She did not look at the dowager. She looked at the king, the tired man from the window, who looked back at her with an expression she could not read. The room waited for her to be destroyed. Into that waiting, the Marquis of Hartsbourne took one step forward from the king's side, and the small movement turned every eye. Because a man so still does not move without meaning. He did not raise his voice. He had never in his life needed to. "This is Miss Winifred Carroway," he said, "and she has insulted no one." The words fell into the bright room and stopped it. He did not make a speech. He had promised himself, 14 years before, that when the room finally came, he would not waste it on rage. He said, in the level voice that carried to every corner because the corners had gone silent to hear it, that he had read the accounts of the Ragby almshouse for indigent musicians, both the fair ledger that hung at Sandsmere for the subscribers, and the rough workings beneath it from which that ledger had been copied, and that the two did not agree, and that the difference between them, gathered over 6 years, came to a sum he then named to the pound into the silence. He said that he held sworn accounts from 4 of the 12 men the fund claimed to relieve, and that not one of them had received a farthing, and that the violinist Galloway, who had played in the late Earl's own household, had set his mark to that truth before witnesses. He said that the true books of the fund had lately been burned at Sandsmere by the founder's own order, every subscription sheet and every disbursement, and he asked the Bright Room to consider what an honest charity has to fear from its own accounts, that it should burn them in the same fortnight a copyist was turned out for reading them. He did not say the word thief. He let the room say it for itself, in the silence, in the slow turning of every powdered head, toward the woman in gray and diamonds beneath her husband's arms. "The young woman you were promised, a viper," he said, and his eyes did not leave the dowager's face. "Kept your fund's true accounts in her own hand for 6 months, and would not copy a lie into a fair book, and call it finished, and gathered the proof of the fraud alone, with no friend and no protector, because her father taught her that a name is the one thing no creditor can seize. She did not slander the crown. She told the truth to a tired man at a window, not knowing who he was, when every titled person in the house had agreed not to know it. I have served His Majesty 14 years. I have never heard the crown better honored than by a girl who told it the truth for nothing." He turned, then, fully, to Winifred in the center of the cleared and silent floor, and he did the thing he had not done since his sister died, which was to let his face be read. "Winifred," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her given name. It went through the room like the first low note of a great instrument finding its voice, and it went through her the same way. "You gave your courtesy to the wrong man that day," he said. "Lo now for her, though the room heard it. Curtsy to no one. Marry me instead." The room did not breathe. That was the whole of it. 11 words, and her name. He did not kneel, and he did not orate, and he did not crush the Dowager Countess beneath a torrent, because the truth he had set down had already done to her what no torrent could, and a man who has waited half his life to be heard has no need to shout when the room is finally listening. The Dowager Countess of Sandsmere stood beneath her dead husband's arms, with the county's eyes upon her, and for the first time in her long armored life, the practiced sentences would not come. She opened her mouth. She said that the accounts were, that the books had been, that the girl was, and each fragment died in the silence, because there was no room left in the bright chamber for the thing she had always relied upon, which was the agreement of decent, frightened people not to look. They were looking now. The Lord Lieutenant, who had been so ready to have the copyist removed, was studying the floor. Miss Penrose had taken one small step away from the great lady's elbow, the way one steps back from a thing that is sinking. The Dowager Countess understood, in a single clear and terrible instant, that her own categories could not measure what had just defeated her, and the understanding aged her in the candlelight by 10 years. The king had not moved through any of it. He sat in his plain dark coat with his heavy watchful face, and let the Marquis finish, and when the silence had held long enough, he spoke. Once, in the unhurried voice of a country squire who has seen the bottom of a great many men. "We came north," the king said, "to see the county as it is, and not as it arranges itself to be seen." He looked at the woman in gray and diamonds without unkindness, and without mercy, only with a great and final accuracy. "We have seen it, Lady Sandsmere. The fund will be examined. The men it owes will be paid, from your estate to the last shilling. And the violinist Galloway shall have a pension from our own hand for the insult of being written into your charity and left to starve under it. As for the slander against our person," he said, and here he turned his heavy face toward the gray gown in the center of the floor, "there has been none. A subject told us the truth at some cost to herself. We are not insulted by that. We find it rather rare." He rose. The room rose with him in a long rustle of silk. He paused before the copyist, who had sunk at last into a curtsy, the right one to the right man, 4 months in a lifetime too late, and he looked down at her with something that was very nearly amusement in his tired squire's face. "You have an ill eye for a steward," he said quietly, so that only she and the Marquess heard it, "but a sound one for a thief. Hartsbourne keeps my music. See that he keeps you better than that woman kept her ledger." And he went out, and the county streamed after him, and the Dowager Countess of Sandsmere was left standing alone beneath her dead husband's arms in a room that had decided, all at once and without a vote, what manner of creature repaid charity with venom, and it was not the girl in gray. She did not stay for the matter to be examined. She withdrew to her dower house in another county within the month, where she was received by no one who mattered, and the almshouse fund was put under honest trustees, and the 12 names in the ledger were sought out one by one, the living relieved and the dead remembered, and old Galloway had his pension and a dry room and a new violin. And he played at the wedding, for there was a wedding in the parish church at Hartsbourne, where the Marquis's people had loved his dead sister, and now made room in their hearts for his living wife, and it was a quiet one, by the standards of a marquisate, because neither of the two who married had any taste left for grand bright rooms. Winifred wore cream, and not gray. The blind violinist played a slow air from the folio she had set in fair order, his sister's music, 20 years silent, given a voice again in the building Florian had grown up in, and the Marquess of Hartsbourne stood at the front of the church and listened to his sister's notes in his wife's clean copying, and did not trouble to keep his face still, there being no longer any reason to. The debt of nearly £400 was paid, of course the morning after the assembly, by a man who could pay it without noticing, but that was not the thing that mended her. The thing that mended her came later, in the first winter of the marriage, when a parcel arrived at Hartsbourne from the market town, sent by the chandler at Galloway's asking, and inside it, wrapped in sacking, were the cracked and mended pieces of a small chamber organ. It was her father's. The half-built instrument the Dowager had carted away, unfinished and unpaid, sold off cheap for its metal broken up and scattered, and tracked down over a winter, pipe by pipe and rank by rank, by a man who kept the king's music and had learned that the proof a careful person needs is gathered patiently and never alone. The Marquess had found the pieces of it the way he had found the witnesses to the fraud, quietly asking in the right poor streets, and he had brought them home to her without a word, because some things are not said, only set down where the right person will find them. Winifred knelt on the cold flagstones of the Hartsbourne Hall with her father's broken pipes in her 2 hands. The medal he had bought with his last savings and his trusting heart, the medal his name had been broken over, and she did weep then, at last, where someone could see, because the someone was her husband. And he had knelt down on the stone beside her without minding his coat, and that was the whole difference between the man at the cold window and every other man in every other bright room. "We will finish it," Florian said. "There is no hurry now. It will keep until you are ready." And in time they did finish it, the 2 of them, and an old organ builder Florian found, who had once been her father's apprentice, in a workshop got up in a dry wing of the great house, and the first time her father's organ spoke again, completed at last after 6 years of silence. It spoke under her own hands in the Hartsbourne chapel on a grey afternoon, with the rain at the windows. And the note it found was full and true and carried to every cold corner of the room, the way the truth had carried in the county rooms, the way her name had carried in the Marquis's voice. And Florian stood beside her in the empty chapel, and listened to a dead man's instrument come back to life under his living wife's hands, and neither of them needed to say the thing that the music was already saying. If Winifred's story has stayed with you, sit a moment with the small worn thing in your own keeping that no one could buy from you. And remember that quiet worth is sometimes seen at last by the one whose seeing changes everything. Thank you for staying with her until the end.